August 15, 1945. The sun beat down mercilessly on Camp Livingston, Louisiana, as Sergeant Eleanor Wills watched the unusual scene unfold before her. Dozens of Japanese women, prisoners of war captured during the Pacific Campaign, stood in rigid formation as the camp commander delivered news that should have sparked jubilation. Japan has surrendered. The war is over. You are free to go, he announced through an interpreter. The women remained motionless, their faces masks of confusion rather than relief. Then something extraordinary happened. Something that defied 4 years of wartime propaganda and centuries of cultural understanding. The senior Japanese prisoner, a former Imperial Navy nurse named Akiko Tanaka, stepped forward and bowed deeply. "Please," she said in halting English, words that Sergeant Wills would remember for the rest of her life. "Please, let us stay." What Sergeant Wills witnessed that humid summer morning defied 15 years of carefully constructed Japanese imperial doctrine. These women, nurses, communication specialists and auxiliary personnel captured throughout the Pacific Theater, were not rushing toward freedom, but begging to remain in captivity. In that moment, watching tears stream down Tanaka's face, Wills realized she was observing the complete collapse of an ideology dismantled not by torture or coercion, but by something far more devastating: exposure to American abundance. The journey that led to this extraordinary moment began years earlier, when Japan's military leadership had crafted a narrative of American weakness and decadence. Throughout the 1930s, Japanese citizens were systematically conditioned to believe Americans were soft, undisciplined, and materially impoverished compared to the spiritually superior Japanese people. School children studied textbooks depicting Americans as physically weak and morally corrupt, unable to endure hardship. Military training manuals described U.S. soldiers as unwilling to sacrifice, lacking the spiritual fortitude that supposedly defined Japanese fighting spirit. Official propaganda from Tokyo portrayed America as a nation of contradictions, vast stretches of poverty punctuated by small islands of excessive wealth. Government-controlled newspapers regularly featured stories about breadlines, the Dust Bowl, and economic collapse. The Great Depression had been particularly useful to Japanese propagandists who pointed to America's economic struggles as evidence of fundamental weakness in Western capitalism and democracy. Imperial censors carefully controlled all information about the United States, ensuring that only images supporting this narrative reached the Japanese public. By 1941, when Japan launched its surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, the average Japanese citizen knew with absolute certainty that Americans lived in material conditions far inferior to those in Japan. They understood that American industrial capacity was exaggerated, that American farmland was depleted, and that American workers were lazy and inefficient. These weren't simply opinions, they were articles of faith reinforced through every channel of communication available to the imperial government. Japanese military strategy relied heavily on this belief system. Planners anticipated that the spiritually weak Americans would quickly sue for peace after suffering initial defeats. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, despite his famous misgivings about awakening a sleeping giant, nevertheless prepared for a war against a nation that his colleagues believed lacked the material resources and spiritual fortitude for a prolonged conflict. The Japanese military leadership was aware of certain American advantages, particularly in raw materials and potential industrial capacity. However, they critically underestimated how quickly and effectively those advantages could be mobilized. More importantly, they failed to anticipate how exposure to American abundance would affect their own people when confronted with irrefutable evidence that contradicted everything they had been taught. This story is about that confrontation, the moment when propaganda collides with reality, when carefully constructed beliefs shatter against the immovable object of evidence. It began not with grand strategy or diplomatic maneuvers, but with something as simple as a slice of white bread. Lieutenant Yumiko Sato had been captured in the Philippines in May 1942 after the fall of Corregidor. As a communications specialist attached to the Imperial Japanese Navy, she expected interrogation, possibly torture, and certainly deprivation. What she received instead was a processed white bread sandwich with sliced ham and cheese, food that had been described as rare luxuries in America, served casually to a prisoner of war. I was certain it was a trick, she later wrote in a letter smuggled back to her family in Kyoto. I thought they were showing me special treatment to make me speak. I refused to eat at first, waiting for the real American rations to appear. When I realized this was the standard food for everyone, even prisoners, I began to question everything I had been taught. Sato was among the first wave of approximately 873 female Japanese personnel captured by American forces throughout the Pacific Campaign. Initially held at temporary facilities near combat zones, they were eventually transported to the continental United States and interned at specialized women's compounds at Camp Livingston, Louisiana and Fort Bliss, Texas. These facilities, originally constructed to house the Women's Army Corps, offered accommodations that unintentionally became instruments of ideological warfare. Captain Robert Montgomery, who supervised the transfer of the first group of 46 female prisoners to Camp Livingston in August 1942, recorded their reactions in his official report. Subject prisoners appeared visibly shocked upon viewing their quarters. Several required reassurance that they were indeed being shown to prisoner barracks rather than officer accommodations. One prisoner, Lieutenant K. Matsumoto, became emotionally overwhelmed upon seeing indoor plumbing and had to be medically attended. The barracks that provoked such reactions were standard-issue military structures, simple by American standards, but featuring amenities that were uncommon in pre-war Japan: electric lighting, indoor toilets, hot and cold running water, and central heating represented a standard of living that many of the prisoners associated only with the Japanese elite. Even more disorienting was the casual manner in which these luxuries were treated by their American guards. The American women waste water in a way that would be criminal in Japan, wrote nurse Chio Yamamoto in a diary later, recovered by occupation authorities. They leave taps running while brushing teeth. They take showers daily, sometimes twice daily in this heat. When I asked Sergeant Miller why they do not conserve water, she looked confused and said, "There's plenty more where that came from." Did not believe her until they showed me the water treatment facility that serves the camp. It processes more water daily than my entire hometown used in a month. These initial impressions were merely the beginning of a systematic dismantling of imperial propaganda that would occur over the next 3 years as the women settled into captivity. Their exposure to American material abundance accelerated, creating cognitive dissonance that proved increasingly difficult to reconcile with their previous beliefs. Food became the most immediate and visceral challenge to Japanese propaganda. The standard POW ration, while reduced from that of American personnel, still provided approximately 200 calories daily, significantly more than many of the women had regularly consumed in Japan, where wartime rationing had reduced civilian intake to approximately 800 calories by 1942. More shocking than the quantity was the variety and quality of food available. Sergeant Marion Jenkins, who supervised the camp kitchen, recorded numerous instances of prisoners questioning the authenticity of their meals. "They keep asking if this is special treatment," she wrote in October 1942. "I had to take 3 of them on a tour of our warehouse to convince them that we weren't depleting local supplies to feed them." Lieutenant Tanaka became visibly upset upon seeing our potato storage, which contained more potatoes than her hometown received in monthly rations. She asked repeatedly if this was the main food warehouse for Louisiana. She couldn't comprehend that it was just for our camp. The prisoners' disbelief extended beyond food to every aspect of American material culture they encountered: medical supplies, clothing, mechanical equipment, and even items considered disposable became sources of astonishment. Captain Julia Rodriguez, the medical officer assigned to the women's compound, documented the reaction when she discarded partially used rolls of medical gauze after treating minor injuries. Nurse Yeda retrieved the gauze from the waste bin and asked why I was throwing away valuable medical supplies. Rodriguez reported, "When I explained our protocols for preventing infection, she became agitated and explained that in Japanese field hospitals, they would wash and reuse gauze until it literally fell apart. She showed me darning techniques they used to extend the life of medical textiles. When I showed her our medical supply room with its hundreds of gauze rolls, she sat down on the floor and wept. Later, she told me she had watched patients die in the Philippines because they had run out of basic supplies, like the ones we were discarding daily. But the revelation extended beyond consumer goods to industrial capacity. In April 1943, as part of a work program designed to reduce the psychological strain of captivity, several prisoners with technical backgrounds were permitted to work under supervision at a nearby cannery processing vegetables for military rations. Lieutenant Haruko Nishimura, an engineer who had worked in food processing in Osaka before the war, experienced what Kemp psychologist Dr. William Barrett described as a profound reality break upon seeing the facility. The machinery is twice as large and 3 times as fast as our most modern facilities in Japan. Nishimura noted in a statement recorded during a psychological evaluation, "One American cannery processes more in a day than my entire factory could handle in a week. And this is not even their main production facility." The supervisor told me this was one of dozens of similar operations. When I expressed doubt, he showed me shipping manifests from other canneries. The numbers were so large, I thought there must be a translation error. When Nishimura learned that much of this production was destined not for frontline troops, but for Lend-Lease shipments to allies, she reportedly became physically ill. "We are fighting a nation that can feed itself, arm itself, and still supply its allies with more than Japan's entire production," she told the camp interpreter. How did we not know this? This question, how did we not know, became increasingly common among the prisoners as their exposure to American abundance continued. The answer, of course, lay in the comprehensive system of information control that had existed in Imperial Japan. Without access to accurate information about American industrial capacity, Japanese citizens and even military planners had no context for understanding the true disparity between the nations. This disparity became painfully clear through countless small encounters. In September 1943, a group of prisoners was taken to a department store in Alexandria, Louisiana, to obtain civilian clothing items not available in military supply. The outing, intended as a routine procurement task, became another moment of revelation. Midori Tanaka, a former clerk at what had been considered an upscale Tokyo department store, wandered through the American store in a state of shock. The quality of fabric available to ordinary Americans is better than what was reserved for luxury clients in Japan, she later told camp administrators, and the quantity, racks and racks of dresses, shelves of shoes in every size. In Tokyo by 1941, we had to turn away customers because we had nothing to sell them. Here, in the middle of war in a small American city, there is more merchandise than I have ever seen. The prisoners were particularly struck by evidence that this abundance reached all levels of American society. When Captain Eleanor Williams arranged for several prisoners to assist with clerical work at the camp headquarters, she unintentionally created another opportunity for propaganda to collide with reality. As the prisoners worked alongside American enlisted personnel, they observed the personal possessions and daily habits that revealed the standard of living enjoyed by even junior military members. Corporal Davis showed me a photograph of her family's farm in Iowa, reported Yoshiko Hobb, a former agricultural ministry clerk. They own 2 tractors for a single family farm. The daughter of a farmer owns a wristwatch, leather shoes, and has a high school education. When I expressed surprise, Davis seemed confused by my reaction. She said her family was not wealthy, just average farmers. In Japan, a family that owned a tractor would be considered very prosperous. A family with 2 would be among the wealthiest in a village. These revelations extended to the personal backgrounds of their American guards. Many of the Women's Army Corps personnel assigned to the camp came from working-class backgrounds that would have placed them among the middle or upper middle class in Japanese society. Their casual references to automobiles, household appliances, and educational opportunities created a comprehensive picture of American life that contradicted everything the prisoners had been taught. Lieutenant Noriko Suzuki, who had worked as a typist for the Japanese Navy headquarters in Tokyo, formed an unlikely friendship with her counterpart, Sergeant Ruth Goldman, who had held a similar position at a manufacturing company before joining the WAC. Their conversations about pre-war life became a systematic comparison of living standards that left Suzuki increasingly disturbed. Goldman spoke of her modest apartment in Chicago. Suzuki recorded in a journal later donated to the National Archives. She described an electric refrigerator, a telephone, a radio, and her own private bathroom. She mentioned these things without pride, as if they were completely ordinary. When I told her that my father is a respected government official, had none of these things in our home in Tokyo, she thought I was joking. But Japan is a modern country, she said. I did not know how to explain that what Americans consider basic necessities are luxuries in Japan, even for the professional class. By mid-1944, the accumulated evidence of American material superiority had created a crisis of faith among many of the prisoners. Their diaries, letters, and interviews reveal a painful process of reconciling reality with the lifetime of propaganda they had absorbed. Some responded with denial, insisting that they were being shown a false version of America, or that the abundance they witnessed was somehow unsustainable. Others experienced depression as they confronted the implications of what they were learning, not just for the likely outcome of the war, but for their understanding of their own society. Captain Sumiko Ito, who had served as an administrator at a naval hospital in Yokosuka before her capture in the Marshall Islands, documented this psychological struggle in remarkable detail. I was raised to believe that spiritual strength would always triumph over material advantage, she wrote. We were taught that Americans were soft, that they would break under pressure because they were accustomed to comfort. Now I live among them, and I see that their comfort doesn't make them weak, it makes them strong. They fight far from home, not from desperation, but from choice, and they fight with weapons of astonishing quality and overwhelming numbers. The abundance I see here is not despite the war effort, but because of the capacity that makes that effort possible. This realization that material abundance and industrial capacity translated directly to military power spread among the prisoners as news of Allied advances reached them through approved channels. Women were permitted access to censored newspapers and radio broadcasts which, even with their pro-American slant, provided enough information to track the war's trajectory. As American forces advanced across the Pacific, capturing island after island and subjecting the Japanese homeland to intensifying bombardment, the prisoners could correlate these military successes with the industrial might they witnessed daily. In January 1945, the prisoners were shown a documentary film about American war production. While intended primarily as entertainment, the film became another vector for dismantling imperial propaganda. The footage of enormous factories producing aircraft, ships, and tanks in quantities that seemed impossibly large had a profound impact on the technically educated prisoners. Lieutenant Aiko Nakamura, who had studied engineering at Tokyo Imperial University, watched the Ford Willow Run bomber plant footage in silent disbelief. When the narrator mentioned that the facility produced one B-24 bomber every hour, she stood up and left the room. Guards found her outside, visibly shaken. "It is not possible," she kept repeating. "Our best aircraft facilities might produce 1 or 2 bombers per week. The mathematics does not allow for such production. There must be some propaganda trick in the film." When offered the opportunity to study technical journals that confirmed these production figures, Nakamura initially refused, saying, "If I accept this is true, then I must accept that everything I was taught about our nation's position in the world is false." This crisis of faith was not universal. Some prisoners maintained their ideological commitment despite the evidence surrounding them. They attributed American abundance to decadence and spiritual weakness, clinging to the belief that Japanese spiritual superiority would eventually overcome material disadvantage. These ideological holdouts created tension within the prisoner community, sometimes ostracizing those who openly expressed doubt about Japan's propaganda narratives, yet even the most committed gradually found their positions difficult to maintain as the evidence mounted and the war's trajectory became clear. By spring 1945, as news of the devastating firebombing of Tokyo and other Japanese cities reached the camp, even former holdouts began to reconcile themselves to the implications of what they had witnessed. Hanako Yoshida, who had been a teacher in Nagasaki before being captured while serving as a military clerk in the Philippines, described this transformation in a statement to camp authorities. "I taught my students that Japan was the equal of any Western power, that our spiritual strength compensated for any material disadvantage. Now I understand that I was teaching a comfortable illusion. The gap between Japan and America is not like the gap between two modern nations. It is like the gap between two different eras of history. We have been fighting a war against a nation that exists 20 years in our future as the material superiority of American society became undeniable. Many prisoners shifted their focus to understanding how this abundance was achieved. They began requesting books on American history, economics and industrial development. Camp authorities, seeing an opportunity for positive engagement, established an informal education program that became unexpectedly popular. Sergeant Helen Martinez, who had been a high school teacher before the war, was assigned to coordinate these educational activities. "I expected maybe a dozen women to participate," she later recalled. Instead, nearly 80% of the prisoners enrolled in at least one class. The most popular subjects were American agricultural methods, industrial organization, and educational systems. They approached these topics with an intensity that was almost desperate, as if understanding American abundance had become a matter of urgent personal importance. This urgency reflected a growing awareness among the prisoners that Japan's defeat would necessitate fundamental changes in Japanese society. As they absorbed information about American institutions and practices, many began to see themselves not just as prisoners but as students, reluctant pioneers who might help rebuild their nation after a defeat that seemed increasingly inevitable. Their American guards observed this transformation with a mixture of sympathy and fascination. Captain Elizabeth Warren, who commanded the women's compound at Camp Livingston from November 1944 until the end of the war, documented the changing attitudes in her monthly reports. The prisoners no longer maintained the rigid military discipline that characterized their behavior upon arrival, she wrote in March 1945. They engage freely with American personnel, ask countless questions about our society, and express concerns about conditions in Japan rather than their own captivity. Many have stated explicitly that they believe they are receiving better treatment as prisoners than their families are experiencing as free citizens in Japan. This belief was tragically accurate, as the prisoners enjoyed 3 meals daily, heated, barracks and adequate clothing. Their families in Japan faced increasingly desperate conditions. By early 1945, civilian food rations in Japan had fallen to fewer than 1,500 calories per day. Clothing was strictly rationed, fuel was scarce, and American firebombing was destroying Japan's cities at an accelerating pace. Letters that occasionally reached the prisoners through the International Red Cross confirmed their fears about conditions at home. Fumiko Hayashi, a communication specialist captured on Saipan, received a letter from her sister in Yokohama in April 1945 that starkly illustrated the disparity. "We receive 350 grams of rice per person weekly." Her sister wrote, "Mother has been ill, but there is no medicine. We burn our furniture for cooking fuel." Hayashi, who had just finished a dinner that included chicken, vegetables and ice cream, showed the letter to Camp Administrator Lieutenant Grace Sullivan. "I am a prisoner eating meat while my family starves as citizens." Hayashi said, "How can I reconcile this? Everything we were taught about America and Japan has proven false. We were told Americans would torture us if captured. Instead, you feed us better than our own military fed us. We were told Japan was winning the war through spiritual strength. Now I learn my city is in ruins and my family is starving. The truth is opposite of everything I believed. This inverted reality, prisoners living better than civilians, captivity offering more security than freedom, reached its logical conclusion on August 15, 1945. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender at Camp Livingston, the prisoners were gathered to hear a translation of the Emperor's radio address, followed by an announcement from Camp Commander Colonel James Whittaker that arrangements would be made for their repatriation to Japan. The reaction, as witnessed by Sergeant Eleanor Wills, defied all expectations. Rather than celebrating their imminent freedom, many prisoners appeared distressed by the news. After Akiko Tanaka stepped forward to request that they be allowed to remain in American custody, 76% of the prisoners signed a petition asking to delay their repatriation. The reasons they gave revealed how completely their worldview had been transformed. "I have nothing to return to," wrote Lieutenant Masako Taniguchi. "My home in Tokyo is destroyed. Here I have food, shelter, and safety. In Japan, I would be another hungry mouth in a starving nation." Beyond these immediate practical concerns lay deeper fears about reintegrating into a society still governed by the ideology they had come to reject. "I no longer know how to be Japanese in the way I was taught," wrote Nurse Yoshiko Kawabata. "I have seen too much, learned too much. How can I pretend to believe what I now know is false? How can I teach others without revealing what I have learned? I fear I would be seen as contaminated by American ideas." This fear of ideological contamination was well-founded. Japanese military personnel who were repatriated immediately after the war often faced suspicion and ostracism. Those who spoke positively about their treatment as prisoners were sometimes accused of having been brainwashed or having collaborated with the enemy. For female prisoners, these suspicions carried additional weight in a society where women's behavior reflected on family honor. Colonel Whittaker forwarded the prisoners' petition to the War Department with his own recommendation that the women be allowed to remain in protective custody until conditions in occupied Japan stabilized. "These women have undergone a profound psychological transformation," he wrote. "They have been exposed to aspects of American society that fundamentally contradict their previous understanding of our nation and their own. This has created a unique vulnerability that merits consideration as we plan for their repatriation." The War Department ultimately denied the request, citing the need to resolve all prisoner-of-war situations promptly now that hostilities had ceased. However, they did authorize a 3-month transition program designed to prepare the women for return to a Japan under American occupation. This program, implemented at Fort Bliss, Texas, combined practical training and skills that might prove useful in rebuilding Japan with psychological preparation for the challenges of reintegration. Dr. Elizabeth Conrad, a psychologist who helped design this transition program, documented the prisoners' concerns in a report that captured their unique perspective. "These women occupy an unprecedented position in the history of warfare. They have lived inside the society of their enemy during a time of total war. They have witnessed American abundance while their homeland experienced increasing deprivation. They have access to ground truth about both societies that few others possess. Their greatest fear is not returning to physical hardship, but to a society that may reject the truths they have witnessed." The transition program attempted to address these fears by framing the prisoners' experiences as valuable knowledge that could contribute to Japan's reconstruction. "You will return not as contaminated, but as informed," instructors told them. "You have seen firsthand the society that will now help rebuild Japan. This knowledge makes you not traitors, but pioneers." This reframing helped many prisoners reconcile themselves to repatriation, though doubts remained. On November 12, 1945, the first group of 123 former prisoners boarded a transport ship in San Francisco Harbor. Sergeant Wills, who had witnessed their initial reaction to news of Japan's surrender, was present for this departure as well. "They no longer wore the expression of fear I saw in August," she later wrote. "Instead, they seemed determined, as if approaching a difficult mission rather than simply going home. Lieutenant Tanaka, who had first asked to remain in America, told me, 'We are returning to a different Japan than the one we left. perhaps it will be ready to hear what we have learned. The Japan to which they returned was indeed transformed. Under American occupation, the nation was beginning a process of democratic reform and economic reconstruction that would eventually create the modern Japanese economic powerhouse. The returning prisoners found a society where old certainties had been shattered and new ideas were cautiously taking root. Their reintegration experiences varied widely. Some, particularly those returning to rural areas where traditional attitudes remained strong, encountered suspicion and sometimes hostility. They were questioned about their time in captivity, with implications of collaboration or moral compromise. Others, especially those with technical or medical training, found their skills in high demand during the Reconstruction period, which helped ease their transition despite lingering ideological suspicions. What united these diverse experiences was the former prisoners' unique perspective on both pre-war Japanese propaganda and post-war American influence. Having seen American society firsthand during wartime, they recognized both the genuine advantages of American systems and the oversimplifications of occupation policies. Many became informal cultural interpreters, helping family members and communities navigate the complex expectations of occupation authorities. Yumiko Sato, whose encounter with the simple ham sandwich had begun her ideological transformation, eventually became an English teacher in Kyoto. In 1973, she gave an interview to an American researcher in which she reflected on her wartime experience. The most powerful weapon America used against Japan was not the atomic bomb but the refrigerator, she said. Material abundance destroyed our military myths more completely than any military defeat could have done. We were taught that Americans were soft because they had refrigerators. Then we learned that Americans had refrigerators because they were productive in ways we could not imagine. This single reversal of cause and effect required us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about both societies. This reconsideration extended far beyond the relatively small number of Japanese women who had been held as prisoners of war. As Japan rebuilt under American occupation, millions of Japanese citizens encountered aspects of American abundance that challenged their previous beliefs. The democratization of Japan, the land reforms, the constitutional changes, all were shaped by Japanese citizens' evolving understanding of the relationship between economic systems and quality of life. For the former prisoners, this national transformation carried personal significance. They had experienced their own version of defeat and reconstruction years before their nation as a whole. The ideological adjustments that had once isolated them from their society gradually became mainstream as Japan embraced aspects of the economic and political systems they had witnessed in America. By 1960, when Akiko Tanaka published her memoir, Between Two Worlds, A Japanese Nurse's Journey from Enemy to Ally, Japan had already begun its economic miracle, achieving growth rates that would eventually make Japanese products synonymous with quality worldwide. In her conclusion, Tanaka drew a direct line between her experiences as a prisoner and Japan's post-war transformation. In captivity, I saw an America that propaganda had hidden from us, not just an America of material abundance, but of systems that created that abundance. What seemed like a defeat became an education. Japan lost a war, but gained a future. I believe that those of us who saw America during the war helped our nation understand that this future did not require us to stop being Japanese, but to reimagine what being Japanese could mean in a world where spiritual strength and material progress could exist together. The story of these women, captured as enemies, transformed by exposure to American abundance, and returning as reluctant pioneers of a new understanding, offers a unique perspective on how ideologies collapse, not through argument or coercion, but through irrefutable evidence that contradicts fundamental beliefs. The ham sandwich that challenged Lieutenant Sato's understanding of American scarcity. The warehouse of potatoes that made Lieutenant Tanaka question Japanese agricultural efficiency. The casual waste of medical supplies that reduced Nurse Aikidas to tears. These material realities accomplished what no propaganda could have done. On that August day in 1945, When Sergeant Eleanor Wills watched Japanese prisoners beg to remain in captivity rather than return to freedom, she witnessed the final stage of this ideological collapse. The women who stood before her and Colonel Whitaker were no longer the dedicated adherents of imperial doctrine who had arrived at Camp Livingston. They had been transformed not by indoctrination, but by refrigerators, by abundant food, by functional plumbing, by the mundane miracles of American industrial capacity that propaganda had failed to prepare them for. In the decades that followed, as Japan rebuilt itself into an economic powerhouse and close American ally, the experiences of these former prisoners took on new significance. Their journey from enemies to allies in miniature foreshadowed their nation's larger transformation. What began with 873 women discovering the gap between propaganda and reality ultimately contributed to a new relationship between former enemies that would help shape the modern world. Today, as visitors to Tokyo marvel at Japan's technological prowess and material abundance, few remember the women who once begged to remain prisoners rather than return to a homeland devastated by beliefs they no longer shared. Yet, their story remains a powerful reminder of how quickly certainties can collapse when confronted with overwhelming evidence, and how prosperity can sometimes be the most revolutionary force of all.